Professor Robinson. So good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. So good to see you. Please call me Russell.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you. Can you introduce yourself for us?
So I'm Russell K. Robinson. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley Law. And my research deals with race, gender, sexuality in various contexts in constitutional law, in anti-discrimination law, and in entertainment and culture. And more recently, I've begun writing more about religion and how that interfaces with sexuality, race, gender, etc.
I'm really looking forward to hearing a lot more about that and what you've been learning. I'm Keisha McKenzie. I'm a technical communicator and narrative strategist, and I've worked with social justice and nonprofit organizations for the last 10 years around religion and advocacy. I'm currently at Everyday Democracy leading narrative and culture work. And I know my life has shaped my perspectives on religious liberty, and I'd love to hear how your life has shaped yours, Russell. So
Yeah,
with
thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work and your life. Um, I have, I guess, for most of my life, lived a very kind of bifurcated experience, very separated. So I was raised in a very fundamentalist Christian community that was also very segregated based on race, um, in that my family was Black. Um, and I have a large extended family in the Dayton, Ohio area. And then I was going to a school called Dayton Christian that was probably 95% white, and very evangelical, very much like a precursor to the MAGA Republicans today. I had kids in school say to me, you know, you can't be a Democrat and a Christian. So there were all these ways in which, I was getting messages from school and from home that in some ways were very different because I was affirmed at home that you can be a Democrat and a Christian. But I think one similarity between the two contexts was that being gay was seen as not really a possibility if you're a Christian. That and mostly was communicated through silence around sexuality in general, and just kind of a lack of speaking about being LGBTQ. There were at the same time occasional homophobic remarks made in both contexts, including at school. Phrases like "that's so gay" to insult somebody, the F word being a common insult that boys would fling at another boy. Sometimes I was on the receiving end of those. So I knew in both contexts that being gay was not an option. And one thing that I say to, especially for like younger folks who've grown up with very different media landscape is like, I didn't have any positive role models of gay men that I could look to and say, like, I want to be like him when I grow up. Here's somebody who's out. Here's somebody who is happy, is healthy. The images were all negative and very stereotyped. And so it was definitely a question of like trying to figure out like how you can be when there's not any mirror that says like, here's a positive way that you can be a Black gay man. And so that's kind of explains my struggle.
Yeah, yeah. The part that I really resonated with was that the early silences, but you still get the underlying message of
Mhm.
being inferior to whatever society has decided is normal or natural or good.
Mhm.
I came into the US maybe about 24 years ago.
Mhm.
And so I'm a recent immigrant, new citizen, but my culture was Black Caribbean Seventh-day Adventist. And so when I grew up in London, it was under a legal climate that didn't allow teachers or the media to talk about anything other than heterosexuality. And the legal term is Section 28 was the legal code that governed that at that time under the Margaret Thatcher regime. And so like growing up with, as you said, no visible models, mentors, examples of anything other than the party line, which was mother, father, 2.5 children,
Mhm.
um, do the education, be on the right side of the law, do not agitate too much, don't draw attention to yourself. All of those messages I got, even without realizing I was getting them. And when I moved to the US and for graduate school, I was learning and being around a much wider variety of human beings. And it really helped me to think differently about some of those default messages that we get.
I think my training as a lawyer and as a legal scholar in particular, and learning to think critically about the law has helped me think critically about scripture.
Mm.
I was raised at a school that sort of taught what they would say was the literal word of God. Um, but that's how they labeled it, right? And then there were all these like minute rules that they justified, like no dancing.
Mhm.
But they couldn't actually point to a Bible verse, but they would say that that was a literal word of God. And so it's like when you're young, when you're like, in elementary school or whatever, you just accept what you're taught.
Mhm.
But then I had a Bible teacher my senior year of high school, Mr. Pyle. Shout out to Mr. Pyle. If somehow he actually watches this, that would be amazing. I'd love to hear from you. And he basically said, there's not much that is clear or black and white in scripture. There's a lot of gray.
Mm.
That just exploded everything that I'd been taught at Dayton Christian up until it was almost like they saved that until the last year because they were like, by the way, everything you've learned is pretty much wrong, right? That like, it's like, you shouldn't kill people, that's clear, right? But there are a lot of things that you have to work out with the Spirit, right? Through your relationship with God.
Mhm.
And that rocked me.
Mhm.
And I think years later, when I was learning about the law, and especially when I became a critical race theorist, which is all about thinking critically about how law and society understand race and kind of dismantling or deconstructing some of the assumptions that are made in law and some of the rules that the law makes about race.
Mhm.
Um, I was able to sort of deconstruct my faith in the same way with some of the same tools. And so I think there was that overlap that, was really exciting and generative. And I would say now God was working through my education and through my career to help me understand my faith, my relationship to Him in a deeper fashion. One thing that I've noticed in looking at the Supreme Court cases where conservative Christians are asking for an interpretation of the Constitution that enables them to discriminate against LGBTQ people is the cases are almost always white Christians,
Mhm.
white conservative Christians, right? And so one of the questions that I have, and I don't even know the right way to try to get at this answer, whether it would be interviewing, Black and Latino congregations, for example, but I don't feel like those groups are bringing lawsuits and that see the court as a means of vindicating their rights. Like that sort of model of thinking about religion as like culture war. And like, I'm going to go to the Supreme Court and they're going to tell me that I can refuse to make a cake for a gay couple because I'm a Christian, right?
Mhm.
Or in another case, 303 Creative, we have a web designer who says that she's evangelical and that her faith requires her not to make a website for a same-sex wedding, right?
Mhm.
And these cases and sometimes are kind of designed by conservative organizations to be test cases to expand the sense of liberty to enable people to discriminate. And I feel like that way of thinking about the courts and public life is not common in communities of color.
Right.
And I guess the best support I can provide for this intuition is, and I think I recount this in my article, What Christianity Loses When Conservative Christians Win at the Supreme Court, is that the surveys show that, like, they've asked people, should a business owned by a religious person have the right to discriminate based on their religious views?
Mhm.
And what we find is that people of color, strong majorities say no,
Mhm.
right? And even you'd be surprised, even white evangelicals, there's a pretty significant split. It's not like 90% of them say like yes.
Right.
I think it's a slight majority that say yes, they should be able to discriminate. But when you look at folks of color who are religious, they're saying no, like they don't see their faith as entitling them to discriminate in the public sphere, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I would love to do more thinking and more research in terms of understanding how there may be a different conception among folks of color, both about how they bring their religion into the public sphere or not, or how they sort of, think about how you inhabit these overlapping identities in public space. And then secondly, the relationship to the courts, right? It's sort of, they don't seem to share this assumption that like the Supreme Court is on my side and I can bring my claim and I'll win. And some context for that is, as you probably know, this Supreme Court, but even before this current conservative supermajority court, for decades, really for all of my life as a lawyer, right? The court has been hostile to claims of racial justice. And so the strategy for groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is usually, let's avoid the Supreme Court. If it's about affirmative action or policing, the strategy is usually, let's try to get a victory at the lower courts. But if we lose, we don't want to appeal to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court will probably not make good law that is protecting our rights as folks of color, right? So I feel like there may be some that might be informing Black and other people of color who are religious, that sort of like the Supreme Court is not your friend. We know that from these cases, and that might also carry over when it comes to religious issues, that we don't expect this Supreme Court to have our back the way that MAGA Republicans and Trump himself has sort of, bragged about how the court, he says, will rule the way that he wants.
Yeah.
And his predictions have unfortunately come pretty true, most recently in the immunity case, right? That sort of, we see the justices that he appointed and other conservative justices sort of lining up behind the Republican Party platform. And I just don't think that folks of color relate to the Supreme Court in that way and see the court as their friend.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something with these intuitions, absolutely. And I think that call it Black skepticism about the system, the legal system, the political system, is entirely based on reality and good history. Thinking about the hypocrisies built into American law from the first colony. Genocide happening and enslavement happening and supported by legal structures from the very first step onto the continent. And then the laws being shaped in the name of religious liberty or protecting fleeing Europeans of a certain kind into the Western Hemisphere, but repressing the religious expression of indigenous peoples, forcibly converting African enslaved peoples. And so repressing Muslim experience and African indigenous spiritualities. That's all been happening alongside the evolution of what we now describe as religious liberty principles here in the US. And thinking about like international influences, 1948 being one of the marker years for the development of international human rights. And as somebody who cares about inclusive religious liberty, like international human rights principles are one of the influences on me. But at the same time as that was developing, mostly led by European countries in the US, like you have the partition of Palestine happening at the same time. So colonialism runs through the evolution of American religious liberty law, the negative impacts on Black and Indigenous people here in this country and various communities across the planet. And so when you are looking clearly at what's happened to your various peoples, you might say to yourself, everybody deserves the same freedoms that I do, but I've never seen this system, this structure, these legal opportunities produce the same results for my people as they might produce for other people. So let me just divest my faith and trust in that system. But when I looked at like some of the statistics around what do Black people believe about the law or church-state separation, which is the idea that the state shouldn't privilege any particular religion or use religion to shape law, there's ambivalences. And like over the last couple of years, as a certain kind of Christian nationalism has risen, you're getting some mixed results from different kinds of people. But still, when they survey Black conservatives, people who might be theologically conservative or have fairly, I don't like to use the word traditional when it comes to social values, but I think you know what I mean. They're still willing, as you said, to defend the rights of people that they disagree with, whether it's theologically or politically. One of the things that activated me during the early 2000s and 2010s, when a lot of the states were thinking about marriage for equality rights, was the willingness of white anti-gay advocates to leverage Black religious leaders.
Mm.
The National Organization on Marriage was very good at this, in fact, of selecting Black pastors who, for their own reasons, were willing to be used in this way to go into Black congregations and stir people up and make gay people, LGBT people, a threat, a social threat, a negative thing, even though LGBT people are in every family, every kinds of family, every kind of community. But they were willing to use these religious leaders, these Black religious leaders, and still use Hispanic religious leaders to kind of fracture the solidarity that I talked about earlier and to leverage the mistrust of difference that I think is a normal part of the human brain, is to be suspicious of the new things, to be suspicious of new things. But we cultivate the practice through empathy and education and spirituality and religion to let the brain grow up a little bit and to surpass our default suspicions of others and to learn to care for others.
Yeah.
But still, like, being willing to use people's fear and being willing to use people's suspicion to restrict the rights and to undermine solidarity. We've seen that happen over and over again. And so I became determined to, like, not let race be used as a way to fracture the progress of justice, to not let people pit LGBTQ people against other kinds of communities like immigrants or women's rights, to not allow the fracturing that's happening now, which is around lesbian, gay, and bisexual people being pitted against trans and gender non-conforming people in civil rights issues. But I think there's something still. I remember the evening of Proposition 8 when we heard that California was going to pass, I forget, what's the best way for us to describe Proposition 8 in
The
2024?
proposition amended the California Constitution to strip the right to marry a same-sex partner from the law. Like, there had been recognition in law that queer folks could marry their partners, and Proposition 8 reversed that.
Right. So during that era, if you remember how much it was the largely white gay advocacy community being sad about Proposition 8, and then being angry with Black religious people as if we were the cause of it passing.
Right.
Then when Proposition 8 eventually fell, there was celebration of that while voting rights was being attacked on the other hand. And so the ways that political organizers and social organizers have been, I guess, easy targets for people who divide and conquer is a deep concern to me, because I think religion at its best, and inclusive religious liberty especially, would train us to not be such easy pickings.
Yeah, can I add a couple of reactions to what you've said? You've said a lot. It's very important. One is when you were talking about, I think this is around 2000, early 2000s, right? Sort of Black pastors striking these kind of transactional deals with white anti-gay groups.
Yeah.
These are folks who weren't working together organically, but there was this, like, troubling alliance. I am almost certain that if you actually looked into those Black churches, there were queer folks in those congregations, but they weren't out. They weren't empowered. There might have been a don't ask, don't tell, like, Pastor so-and-so knows about Russell, but, we just don't talk about his lifestyle, right? In quotes, right? And so, but that invisibility and that silence meant that we didn't have open contestation of this idea that aligning for a Black church to align itself with a white anti-gay movement is progress for that Black church, right? If you understand that people in your congregation, Black folks who are part of your church family, are going to suffer because of this alliance you're making with white anti-gay people, it's harder to move that forward, right? But if we, in these faith spaces, are holding our tongue and, allowing things to go because we are afraid to speak our truth and to fight, then, we facilitate this unholy alliance, I would say.
Mhm. Now we have this opportunity to think, how can we shape these legal structures that we have created to serve this new sense that the law should work for everybody? There was a set of organizers who I think I am probably much more progressively theological than they are. And even they, during the debates around whether a website designer should be forced to serve gay clients or whether a baker should be forced to serve a wedding cake. Um, Even they would say all people have dignity and should enjoy the same basic rights to care for themselves and their families, to exercise their faith and live without fear of discrimination or retribution. But how that actually plays out is really interesting and tends to fall back on these same dualistic lines that you were pointing out, that sure, everybody should have the same rights, but still, like, the people should be able to deny you public service.
Mhm.
And when I think about inclusive religious liberty, that's down to a couple of core principles: that religion shouldn't be absolute over all other kinds of rights, that people still have autonomy, that we should still be valuing public education for all kinds of children and not just the children whose parents can pull them out of public school and get the curriculum that they want. So networking religious liberty with other kinds of rights, freedom of association, freedom of expression. Religious liberty should be non-discriminatory, and so not enshrining in um, debates about whether to give a religious institution an exception from non-discrimination policy, not giving that institution the ability to put conservative Christians over people who don't have any religion at all, and then not coercing behaviors from religious minorities, and making sure that we are framing things in a neutral way that they apply to everybody, and thinking about democratic principles, because we've worked really hard in this country to shape a logic around democracy and people's ability to contribute to the world that they're living in. Um, or to think about pluralism and to not frame law only in terms of one kind of person. So in everyday terms, what could those values help us do? And so if I think about some of these recent cases that you've looked at and started to describe, how are you seeing the values of the current system shaping the way that religious liberty is playing out in specific cases, and whether it's state legislation, not state legislation, state cases, or at the Supreme Court level?
Yeah, so definitely I see a trend in terms of a lack of neutrality in the court's treatment of religious liberty claims.
Mhm.
And so we talked a little bit about the Masterpiece Cake Shop
Mhm.
case, right? Where you have the Colorado baker who's evangelical and says that he can turn away a male couple that wants a cake to celebrate their union. And I should note that that refusal was very upsetting to the men in that relationship. One of them burst into tears when he was told that, they would make a cake for him. His mother was there. He felt humiliated. The court didn't include those facts in the opinion because the court ultimately concluded that the baker was the victim of discrimination, of religious discrimination, right? Instead of sort of recognizing that there's a queer couple that was harmed, the court focused exclusively on the baker and claimed that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was biased against Christians.
Mhm.
And so what I see in that opinion is a lack of neutrality in that there's a harm that was suffered by this queer couple, and yet their harm wasn't even named in the opinion. right? And instead there was a fixation on the heterosexual evangelical and the supposed harm that he experienced because his religion wasn't understood, the court said, by the Civil Rights Commission. But more broadly, during the same week that the court decided Masterpiece Cake Shop, it also heard the challenge to the Muslim ban, right? So this may seem like ancient history for those that, 2017, right? But, Trump comes into office and one of the first things he does is issue this order restricting travel to and from several Muslim majority countries. And he had promised during his campaign to ban Muslims from entering the United States. All sorts of hateful rhetoric, Islamophobic rhetoric about Muslims. And the court, when it hears the case, basically says that those statements are irrelevant. We're not going to look at that. This law does not violate the Constitution. And so it's important to juxtapose those cases, which were decided the same week, because it's not even that the court is preferring religion to sexual liberty. It's that they're preferring white Christian religion, a certain version of white Christianity over Muslims asserting we have a right to our faith as well, right? And so it's not an even-handed protection of religious liberty, it's Christianity, right? It's in keeping with the founding of our country and this sense of a preference for Christianity, even as we have claims and the founding documents of the Constitution that say that religious liberty is supposed to be available to everybody. So one context where this is coming up that I actually find some hope and some excitement is that we have individuals and groups of lawyers planning and carrying out lawsuits testing the neutrality of these religious principles, religious liberty principles, right? So for example, there are lawsuits saying that the Dobbs decision, where the court overturned Roe versus Wade, that there are limits to Dobbs when people who are religious say that my faith requires me to be able to terminate a pregnancy, right? Or to be able to help somebody who is in crisis and needs support. That a law that would say that I am breaking the law because I help a woman or a non-binary person that is needs help in terms of ending the pregnancy. Sort of my faith requires me to step into that space and to help that person who is struggling. And so courts are being asked to decide, could the right of religious liberty include the right to break the state law in a red state that says, you can't terminate a pregnancy, you can't help somebody. If you drive somebody to a clinic, that's violating the law. These lawsuits are saying there is a religious liberty to express our faith through helping people that are in crisis. I think there are also arguments being crafted around trans identity and gender affirming care and saying that sort of, my faith requires me as a doctor to provide this care to my patients. But the state can't tell me that I can't do that. And if this law is really neutral, judges are not supposed to step in and say like, oh no, Christianity doesn't require you to terminate your pregnancy, or Christianity doesn't require you to help somebody who wants to terminate her pregnancy, right? That sort of the judges are not supposed to impose their own view of what religion is. It's supposed to be a neutral vessel, which is one of the reasons why it's if you really embrace this idea that people can break general laws based on whatever they think God has told them, it's basically an invitation to chaos, right? Because if we can't vet those claims, then anybody can say like, oh, the Spirit calls me to do X, Y, and Z, to discriminate, to enact violence, to discriminate in the workplace, right? And so that's why we have several opinions that the court seems to be resisting that had said, you have to follow the law, right? The fact that you're a Christian doesn't mean that you get to break discrimination laws, that you can discriminate against Black people or an interracial couple or somebody who's Jewish, because your faith calls you to do that. That everybody plays by the same rules when you're in the marketplace. Your faith doesn't enable you to make up your own rules, your own kingdom, right? And this Supreme Court is really struggling with that sense of neutral laws have to be followed by everybody. They've crafted small exceptions in cases like Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, an adoption case, and in cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop. So they're starting to sort of make new law, and we're just not sure how far they're going to go in terms of saying that people who are religious have the freedom to do basically whatever they want. But I think having these counter cases, right, where it's progressive people, progressive religious people saying, my faith requires me to be able to terminate pregnancy, it's really going to force the court to sort of reckon with their own lack of neutrality when it comes to interpreting the Constitution.
And I really appreciate the point of saying one rendering of religion has dominated in the law. And it's important for us to make that picture much more complicated, because I think ultimately the question we need to ask is, what is the law for? And what should it protect? For whom? We hope everybody. Because in the end, if the marketplace or the public sphere is for everybody, then that has implications for things like education and for access to healthcare and for adoption and family rights. And for even the ways that we talk about what citizenship is and who should have access to it and under what circumstances. I think when we're talking about some of these public service or I guess retail cases where somebody's trying to buy something and out of religious conviction, people say, I don't want to do that. I wonder if that collapses the conversation about religious liberty, because it makes it almost an economic question of they're willing to give up the potential for profit, so they must be sincere about it. Whereas I would love us to think, and I'm not a doctor or a lawyer, but I am interested in those cases where it's about care, where the question is about care or the question is about quality of education. So I remember 2017 or so, a young trans man by the name of Gavin Grimm was simply trying to go to school and to be able to use the bathroom while at school without being singled out for difference, because the school at one point did offer, but then retracted under pressure, Gavin's ability to use the bathroom of his choice. And so like those kinds of more they're more relational questions of what does it mean to single out somebody who is in their mid to late teens, isolate them socially? What's the consequence of doing that and making that a legal requirement that teachers have to do that, have to create that harm? I have questions about that, not only about what I thought was settled questions around going to a counter and being able to be served. Like we were having those conversations in the 1960s. Lots of sit-ins and at Woolworths counters all over the South, in the North. The retail questions I had thought, and many people had thought, were settled, but we're asking them again. And I think we should also be asking those questions about care and access and social well-being, because I think those are the places where, if we're going to shift how religious liberty actually works for people, it works in the tangible ways that we live, which is not just as consumers, either spending money or making money. So that's one of the ways in which I'm hopeful that the current crop of cases will inspire us to ask a broader set of questions about what it means to be free and who should be able to live life well.
Yeah, you said a lot. That's really valuable. And I think lawyers tend to frame disputes about rights. And I think that the right wing sees constitutional rights as like a culture war, that like, we can go to the Supreme Court and we can get the justice to say that we have a right to discriminate in a business, right? To turn people away when they want a cake or a website designed for their wedding. And I feel like faith, spirit calls us to be asking about care, not rights, right? It's not about like, oh, what do I have the right to do? And I'd look to, the Bible and it tells me you have a right to do A, B, and C. No, that's not, I don't understand that that's what the Bible is doing, right? Giving us lists of rights that we can then use against other people. Instead, I see questions about care, questions about love, like what is loving in any given situation. And so it's sad to me that people who call themselves Christians would think that the loving thing is to tell a couple that you won't make a cake for them.
Mhm.
It's sort of like that is seen as, that baker is turning to a discourse of rights instead of care,
Mhm.
right? And so, this is why I called my article "What Christianity Loses When Conservative Christians Win at the Supreme Court," that they are writing into law a version of Christianity that thinks that we are gladiators in a culture war, and we are trying to get a legal right to demean and diminish people who are different from us, and to insult them when they come into a business and ask for a service. And I have to make a point that a brilliant research assistant, Aisha Spencer, if she ever watches this, made to me that I then incorporated into my article, which is, so Chief Justice Roberts in the Fulton case basically makes the claim that the fact that this Catholic charity is turning away same-sex couples is not a big deal because there are other adoption providers that would service LGBTQ people who want to adopt.
Mhm.
And Aisha pointed out, like in the 1960s, the argument was never, the court wouldn't say like, oh, it's okay for a barbecue restaurant to say no blacks in the window, because if you walk down the block, you'll find a business that serves black people. That the court understood that that was a major blow to one's dignity, to not know when you go into the marketplace whether you will be accepted or not when you go to any given restaurant, and to have to face that fear and anxiety and that sense of being dismissed, right? That a company would say, we don't like you and we won't serve you, right? And that the response was not, oh, as long as there's another barbecue restaurant in the city, it's okay for restaurant A to have a no blacks sign in the window, right? And so you can sort of see how this court is really abandoning foundational principles about a common good that we thought were established in the 60s through the 80s, and really sort of dismantling that and giving people rights to demean and diminish and to hurt people. And again, I think we need, for those of us that are spiritual, a discourse of care, and to try to infuse that into the law instead of thinking this is all about who has the right to insult and hurt somebody else.
Yeah. And so to take those common goods of health care and freedom to work, freedom from
Mhm.
discrimination, freedom from violence,
Mhm.
and to make sure that the legal strategies are enhancing those social goods for everybody and
Right.
not kind of balkanizing them so that only people who have resources can access them, or only people who are of a particular religion can access them. So if we ultimately want the law to serve the good of society, then we have to think about that public good, common good, and make sure the law feeds into that. That's
Right,
what
the
I hear.
beloved community that everybody's involved, nobody is left out of the circle, and that we're not going to interpret the law in a way to establish a special favorite where conservative Christians get to do things that, say, Muslims or Jews can't do.
Mhm. So to come back to that question of joy and hope, what do you hope for the future of religious liberty?
Mhm. I hope for a return to neutral principles. I hope that these new cases, again, around reproductive justice and rights that are asking the courts to confront this sense of like, well, what do you do with the person that says my faith requires me to be able to terminate a pregnancy? I hope that it leads to a course correction, and that we return to principles, which, I mean, it's odd to say this, but I mean, and I think it's a 1990 case, Smith, by Justice Scalia, of all people, right? Who actually says if the law is generally applicable, if it applies to everybody, you don't have a right to disobey it just because your faith tells you that you should be able to, right? And I think that actually came from a place of his own experience as a devout Catholic, and
Mm.
understanding that like the best thing for Catholics is not exceptions, right? That judges start picking and choosing which religious people get to disobey the law. That's actually not good for everybody. And so a rule that's general, that's neutral, that says we all have the same rights, nobody has a special ability to disobey the law because of their own conception of their faith. That is, I think, where we need to return to yeah, a legal rule that says everybody's included, everybody has the same rights in the marketplace, and we're not going to have judges picking and choosing based on their own religious preferences.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I sometimes struggled with when I was working with the Law Rights and Religion Project to think about those principles of
Mhm.
inclusive religious liberty. Neutrality was the one I struggled with most because it felt like asking for the bare minimum. Like the
Mhm.
bare minimum is that the law works for everybody. But on the other end of the scale, I think this question of what do all these people in society who have very different backgrounds and needs and context, how can this legal environment ensure that they live well, that they are flourishing lives? I think that question, the pluralism question, the inclusion question, is that's where like my heart pulls me and what I hope can inspire the people who are making the law work for us. Because if we don't have like the maximalist ideal kind of drawing us forward, then it's much more easy to get trapped in the the concrete details of the specific case in front of you, the single individual experience. But I think zooming out kind of makes things more effective for more people. And so, like, I am longing for more conversations about how inclusive religious liberty can actually play out in people's lives, people from
Mhm.
different perspectives and disciplines and backgrounds, especially because of the thing that you talked about just a minute ago, that the trend has been for the law to be interpreted in ways that create more and more exceptions for more and more kinds of people. And so the hollow core of society is kind of being dismantled piece by piece. And at the same time, like we're seeing in surveys of communities across the country, nearly 70% of people who live here in this country don't feel they belong.
Mm.
Like 7 out of 10 people don't feel that they
Wow.
belong. They have some feeling of being excluded, some feeling of not fitting in or not being welcome. And there are similar statistics around unbelonging or non-belonging in families and
Mm.
at work. So we have this kind of social crisis of feeling alienated.
Yeah.
And I think that the legal trend that we've talked about of dismantling the common good and making people fight for the scraps on society's edges for the right to education without being oppressed, for access to work and not being discriminated in either accessing or keeping work, or the ability to go into a hospital and not have to argue with the doctor about whether you are who you say you are
Yeah.
and whether you should get the procedure that you're supposed to get. All of those very practical things are parts of what contribute to feelings of non-belonging. And so I think that it's unquestionable that religion has played a role in setting up this kind of legal environment. And so as a religious person, I feel some accountability for making sure that religion actually can be a positive force in our pluralistic culture, even for people who are not part of religion at all. And so we have to come to some sort of agreement about what the state is and what it's for and who it should serve, and the civil rights that we are talking about that should protect that common core, that common good. And they protect vulnerable people and they preserve freedom for all of us.
That's a great place to land the plane. I agree with everything that you just said.
Thank you so much for talking with us. It's been wonderful.
Same to you. I really enjoyed this.